you ever wondered how to express plans or commands that were made in the past, but maybe didn't happen as expected? In English, we use the phrases was to and were to talk about actions that were planned, arranged, or even commanded in the past. These forms help us look back and describe what was supposed to happen, whether or not it actually did. Today we'll break down how and when to use was to and were to with clear examples and tips. Let's start by understanding the basics before diving into specific situations. Phrases was to and were to are used to talk about things that were planned, arranged, or commanded in the past. Sometimes these things happened as expected, but other times they didn't. The choice between was and were depends on the subject. Use was for singular subjects like he, she, or it, and were for plural subjects like we, they, or you. This structure helps us reflect on past intentions, whether fulfilled or not. Next, let's see how these forms work when plans don't go as expected. Uncommon use of was to and were to is to talk about plans that were made in the past but didn't actually happen. For example, imagine you had a meeting scheduled for yesterday, but it was postponed. You could say, the meeting was to take place yesterday, but it was postponed. This structure clearly shows that the arrangement was made, but something changed. It's a useful way to explain why something didn't happen as originally planned. Let's look at a real example. The meeting was to take place yesterday, but it was postponed. Here you can see how was to is used to show that the meeting was planned, but something prevented it from happening. This is a practical way to talk about events that were scheduled but didn't occur. It's especially useful in business or daily life when explaining why something didn't go as expected. Another example is, they were to sign the Housing.com deal last week, but negotiations stalled. This sentence tells us that there was a plan for the deal to be signed, but it didn't happen because of stalled negotiations. Using were to here makes it clear that the arrangement was made for a group of people, but circumstances changed. This structure helps you communicate unfulfilled group plans effectively. Sometimes was to and were to are used to talk about events that were destined to happen later. This use is more reflective, looking back at history and seeing how things turned out. For example, you might say, he failed his first exam, but he was to become a great scientist. This means that even though he failed at first, his future success was almost meant to be. It's a way to show how past events led to important outcomes. Consider the sentence, he failed his first exam, but he was to become a great scientist. This example shows how was to can highlight a turning point in someone's life. Even though the initial result was disappointing, the phrase suggests that something greater was waiting in the future. It's a powerful way to connect past struggles with later achievements, making your storytelling more engaging. Another inspiring example is, that small tech startup was to change the entire world. Here, was to is used to show that, although the company started small, its destiny was to make a huge impact. This structure is great for telling stories about how humble beginnings can lead to extraordinary results. It adds a sense of fate or inevitability to the narrative. Phrases was to and were to are also used to talk about commands or duties given in the past. This use is common when describing strict instructions or responsibilities that someone was expected to follow. For example, the guards were to check every ID card at the gate. This means that checking IDs was a duty assigned to the guards. It's a clear way to express past obligations. Take the example, the guards were to check every ID card at the gate. This sentence shows that the guards had a specific responsibility. Using were to makes it clear that this was an instruction given to a group. It's a useful structure for describing rules or expectations that were set in the past, especially in formal or official situations. Another example is, she was to report to her manager by 9 a.m. This sentence tells us that reporting to the manager was a duty or command given to her. The use of was to emphasizes that this was a specific instruction, not just a suggestion. It's a precise way to talk about past obligations in a professional context. Use was to and were to correctly. Remember this quick formula. For singular subjects like I, he, she, or it, use was to. For plural subjects like you, we, or they, use were to. For example, I was to leave early or we were to meet them. This simple rule helps you form sentences accurately every time. Let's practice with singular subjects. For example, he was to start the project, or she was to call the client. In both cases, was to is used because the subject is singular. This pattern works for any individual person or thing. It's a straightforward way to talk about one person's past plans or duties. Now let's look at plural subjects. For example, they were to finish the report, or we were to attend the conference. Here, were to is used because the subject is more than one person. This structure is perfect for talking about group plans or shared duties in the past. It's important to note that was to and were to can describe both fulfilled and unfulfilled plans. For example, she was to travel to Paris and she did, versus she was to travel to Paris but her flight was canceled. The context and additional information in the sentence show whether the plan happened or not. You can use was to and were to express regret or disappointment about plans that didn't happen. For instance, I was to join the concert but I got sick. This structure helps you communicate missed opportunities or changes in plans with a sense of emotion. In storytelling, was to and were to add depth by showing what characters intended or were expected to do. For example, the hero was to save the city but fate intervened. This makes your stories richer and more engaging as readers or listeners understand the original plan and what changed. You can use was to and were to in both formal and informal situations. In business, you might say, the report was to be submitted by Friday. In casual conversation, we were to meet at the park. This flexibility makes these forms useful in many types of communication. To make negative sentences, simply add not. For example, he was not to enter the room, or they were not to speak during the ceremony. This structure is useful for expressing forbidden actions or rules that were said in the past. You can also use was to and were to in the passive voice. For example, the building was to be completed by June. This emphasizes the action or result rather than who was responsible. It's common in formal writing or reports. These forms are great for expressing expectations that were set in the past. For example, the team was to deliver the project on time. This shows that there was a clear expectation or goal, whether or not it was met. Sometimes was to and were to can be used to express surprise about how things turned out. For example, no one knew that quiet student was to become a famous artist. This adds an element of surprise or irony to your story. You can use these forms to talk about missed opportunities. For example, we were to visit the museum but it was closed. This helps you explain why something enjoyable or important didn't happen as planned. Obligations or duties in the past are often described with was to and were to. For example, she was to finish the assignment by Monday. This makes it clear that there was a responsibility or requirement set in the past. These forms are also used for arrangements made in the past. For example, the party was to start at 7 p.m. This shows that there was a plan or arrangement, whether or not it happened as scheduled. When giving instructions in the past, was to and were to are very useful. For example, you were to call me when you arrived. This shows that the instruction was given before and you're now reflecting on it. Rules set in the past can be described with these forms. For example, students were to wear uniforms every day. This makes it clear that the rule was established and expected to be followed. For events that were scheduled in the past, use was to or were to. For example, the concert was to begin at 8 p.m. This structure is perfect for talking about planned events, whether or not they happened. Appointments or meetings arranged in the past can be described with these forms. For example, I was to see the doctor at 10 a.m. This makes it clear that the appointment was set regardless of whether it happened. You can also use was to and were to talk about hopes or dreams that were set in the past. For example, he was to become a pilot but plans changed. This shows that there was a hope or dream even if it didn't come true. Promises made in the past can be described with these forms. For example, she was to help me with my homework. This shows that there was a promise or commitment, whether or not it was kept. Plans often change, and was to or were to help you explain this. For example, we were to travel abroad but the trip was cancelled. This structure is perfect for talking about plans that didn't work out. Use these forms to talk about schedules set in the past. For example, the class was to start at 9 a.m. This makes it clear that there was a set schedule regardless of what happened. Goals set in the past can be described with was to and were to. For example, they were to finish the project by May. This shows that there was a goal or deadline, whether or not it was achieved. Expectations set in the past are often described with these forms. For example, you were to complete the form before arrival. This makes it clear that there was an expectation or requirement. Arrangements made in the past are often described with was to and were to. For example, the car was to be delivered on Monday. This shows that there was a plan or arrangement regardless of the outcome. Instructions given in the past can be described with these forms. For example, he was to lock the door before leaving. This makes it clear that there was a specific instruction or rule. Responsibilities assigned in the past can be described with was to and were to. For example, they were to organize the event. This shows that organizing the event was their responsibility. When instructions are given to groups, use were to. For example, the students were to submit their essays by Friday. This makes it clear that the instruction was for more than one person. Prohibitions or rules against actions in the past can be described with these forms. For example, visitors were not to enter the restricted area. This makes it clear that there was a rule or prohibition. Opportunities that were available in the past can be described with was to and were to. For example, she was to join the special program but missed the deadline. This shows that there was an opportunity even if it wasn't taken. Surprising outcomes can be described with these forms. For example, no one expected that quiet boy was to win the competition. This adds an element of surprise to your story. Failures or things that didn't go as planned can be described with was to and were to. For example, the team was to win the match but lost. This shows that there was an expectation but it wasn't met. Successes that were planned can also be described with these forms. For example, she was to lead the project and she succeeded. This shows that the plan was fulfilled. Sum up, was to and were to are powerful tools for talking about past plans, arrangements, commands, and even destiny. They help you express what was intended, whether or not it happened. Practice using these forms in your own sentences to become more confident and clear when talking about the past. Remember, context is key to showing whether the plan was fulfilled or not. Keep practicing, and soon you'll use these structures naturally in both writing and speaking.